This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Erica Pearson. This episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by the Minnesota Historical Society and Primrose Schools. Today's show is about a bachelormania craze that swept a small Minnesota town called Herman in 1994. The story of the town having 78 bachelors and fewer than a dozen unmarried women was picked up in newspapers around the world. Then, it did the equivalent of going viral for the time. Thousands of love letters and phone calls followed, and Herman's eligible bachelor farmers were everywhere on national television, including on the Oprah Winfrey Show. This question came to us from Brian Roseanne. Here's Brian.
I remember around the mid-90s hearing about a town in Minnesota that was lacking in single women. I remember it got a lot of attention from the national media and local media, of course. And I wonder about whatever happened to that town and the people who met that way.
Thanks so much to Brian for this great question. I'm here today with my colleague, Jenny Berg. Jenny, welcome. Thanks for being here.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
So I asked you to tackle this question for us because of your role as a Greater Minnesota reporter for the Minnesota Star Tribune. Can you tell us a little bit about your coverage area and what you write about? And I know that you send out a newsletter every day.
Yes, correct. So I live in St. Cloud and I cover central Minnesota. And this means that I really get to cover a little bit of everything. So what's happening with area cities and schools and universities and businesses. I keep tabs on crime and court cases going through the system, sometimes even sports. And occasionally I get to delve into something really wacky and fun like this story. And then, I send out a newsletter every day.
What interested you about this story?
Well, like most people, I'm sure, when I saw the question and did a quick Google search, I was immediately curious myself. Like, what an odd news tidbit. And more than this weird thing that sort of went viral at the time, some marriages and children actually came from it. And I will say also, as a reporter who covers, really the gamut from crime to politics to whatever else is breaking, a story like this feels really refreshing to dive into.
So first of all, where is Herman and what's it like there?
Yeah, it's a rural town in western Minnesota, pretty much the center of the state going north to south and about a half hour from the South Dakota border. And it strikes me as a pretty run-of-the-mill small town. It's got a main street with a grain elevator and a gas station and a bar. Sprinkled in are a few churches, maybe 400 people. And then it's surrounded by miles and miles and miles of farmland and a few lakes.
Got it. So how did Bachelormania start? It didn't begin with a call for eligible singles, right?
Yeah, far from it. The town's economic development director, Dan Ellison, who was also a farmer, shared concerns at a meeting about the town's lack of economic opportunities for women. This was in February of 1994. And news stories from the time say he talked to town officials about the results from a poll of high school students at the time that found that 25 of the girls, of them, none of them planned to stay in Herman. So local news picked up the story, as did the Star Tribune, which then published in May that town officials came up with a list of maybe 80 bachelors between the ages of 20 and 50. And they had trouble coming up with the names of 10 women in that same age range who, were single.
Wow. And so what was the initial reaction and the coverage like?
At first, I think a local paper reported on the meeting, not much. I think some TV stations had covered it. And so Ellison told the Star Tribune reporter that after it was on some of the local TV stations, the town started getting a trickle of letters or calls from single women across the country, sometimes even, California, Kansas, Kentucky. But then he told the reporter, it was not meant to be this mail order matchmaking operation. They really did want to find and create good jobs to attract women, both single women and married women, couples, to just come to the town. And so, the meeting was in February, and the Star Tribune wrote its story in May. And what sparked this all was really an Associated Press story that came out the next day.
And how did that manage to capture the national attention?
Yeah, so the Star Tribune's headline was "Town Working to Create Employment Opportunities for Women." So pretty straightforward, right? From the meeting, what he said. And the day after that story was published, the AP had a story that led with "Wanted, a few good women." And then it was like a free-for-all with national talk shows and evening news shows picking up the story and descending upon the town.
Wow. And you talked with some of the bachelors today. What did they tell you about their experience?
Yeah, most thought it was in good fun, although, the media attention made them uncomfortable. Gary Finley, who got married out of this bachelormania and now has 5 children and a couple grandkids, said he was hesitant at first, but then he was like, you know what have I got to lose? I think he was 41 at the time. So he went on 2020, and afterwards he got, I think, 700 phone calls, like phone ringing off the hook nonstop for days. In the mail, he was getting bottles of wine and fruit baskets and long letters from women all across the country, just pouring their life stories into it. And another bachelor at the time, Ken Hansen, said that he went out to LA for a talk show with 4 other bachelors. And they actually had 15 single women from Minnesota flown out, and they did sort of a matchmaking event on the show. And Hansen said that he didn't really like how it was done. He felt bad for the women who weren't picked. But he called the time a whirlwind. It was just chaos.
Yeah. What were some of the wildest things that happened at the height of Bachelormania? I know you talked about an auction in the town and...
Right. Yeah. So I think to respond to the attention, they had to plan some events. So they had a bachelor auction that they did at the county fairgrounds. And, according to news reports at the time, busloads of women arrived in town for that. And then they went on dates while camera crews from national TV shows filmed them. The local cafe, other businesses sort of had fun with it. They made shirts that said, "Bachelortown, U.S.A. You catch 'em, we feed 'em." I know. And I think they planned a Bachelormania block party the next summer, but I think it was kind of fizzling out by then.
Wow. So what was it like to be a Herman bachelor during that time?
Before Bachelormania, I think it was really like any other town, right? These are mostly farmers who, when they got a break from, milking the cows and tending to crops, they might head into town for a drink. The problem, they said, was there was just no women to meet when they did so. But after it went viral, the town officials started offering up the single men to the talk shows and news stations because they had to find new people to interview.
Wow. So what were some of the shows they were on? I know Brian mentioned Oprah in his question, but I know there were more.
Yeah, I think, new shows like 2020, A Current Affair, Dateline, Fox News came into town, but also Lisa Gibbons.
So really, like you could be flipping the channel, and the Herman Bachelors could be on like 3 or 4 as you're changing, from one to the next. I love it.
Exactly.
Okay. So Brian also asked about what the lasting impact was for all of this attention for Herman, and let's get into that after the break.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
History doesn't only exist in the pages of a book. History exists all around us. You just have to dare to look. Listen to Minnesota Unraveled, a podcast from the Minnesota Historical Society. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
We're back. So what happened after all those news crews left?
Gary said it went back to normal pretty quickly. These were farmers who had to keep working, so they did.
And it did bring about some enduring matches, right? Can you tell us about some of the couples?
It certainly did. Gary and Rhonda Finley, the couple with 5 kids and 2 grandkids, was certainly a success story. Rhonda was from Underwood, which is maybe an hour north of Herman, and she had an apartment in Fergus Falls where she worked as a nurse. And she wrote a letter to Gary after seeing him on 2020. And Gary had been receiving these letters that were 10 pages long, life stories of women. And hers said, "Not much going on, but would be fun to talk to you sometime." And that's it. She didn't even have a phone number to call, just her name. So he tracked her down and they talked on the phone. I think he was, curious, but also frustrated that that's all she would write. But I think, really they had a lot in common. Like this is my favorite tidbit. Gary would tend his farm and his cows all day, and then he would go pick Rhonda up for a date. But she was helping on her parents' farm. So when Gary went to pick her up, he helped with the chores so they could get them done quickly. And then they would go on a date, either to a movie or dinner. So they really, had kind of similar lifestyles already.
They're a great match. Let's hear a little bit from Gary here.
I still have people they'll ask where I'm from, and I'll say Herman, and they still remember it, after all these years. I was in St. Cloud Farm Show. I had a guy there say, "Herman, remember that Herman Bachelormania?" I smiled at him and didn't say nothing. "You weren't part of that, were you?" And he said, "Well," I said, "I got married at 41, had 5 kids, and I was part of it." But there's still people that ask, and it's amazing how many people ask, how many people remember that.
So how about some of the other bachelors?
Yeah, so Ken Hansen, who I mentioned earlier, who went out to LA for that talk show, he did get married, but not until a decade or so later. And then there was Gary's brother, Dan, who ended up getting married to a woman from New York who also saw the 2020 story and ended up putting a singles ad in the paper. And they are still together. And then there's Dan Ellison, the economic development director who started this whole thing, who got married during Bachelormania. And he and his wife had a son. He's now remarried happily. And he told me that he doesn't really do interviews anymore. So I think he's just, tired of talking about this all these years later. And there were at least 2 more bachelors who got married. One is now divorced and another passed away.
Got it. So did the whole thing lead to greater economic opportunities for women and give the town a population boost in the end?
Not really. I think about 60 people moved to the town, maybe a half dozen businesses opened. The Star Tribune reported in 1996. But that growth was short-lived. Today, there's about 400 people, and it's smaller than it was in 1994.
Got it. Well, there was a movie about Herman, though, right?
There was, yes. And I don't think it's a whole lot of commercial success. Herman, U.S.A. was released in 2001, and it was filmed in Minnesota, but in New Germany, which is kind of between Hutchinson and the Twin Cities. And that's because there weren't enough hotel rooms in Herman to accommodate a cast and crew. I think it loosely followed the story. It dramatized events and relationships. But in the movie, farmers had pigs instead of cows. And Gary and Rhonda said they went to the premiere in Fargo, and the director asked him what he thought. And he was like, "You know what? They don't feed hogs like that. Like, you showed it wrong."
Oh, they should have talked to Gary and Rhonda. That's so funny. I will have to add that to my list. So did you get any interesting feedback from readers after this Curious Minnesota story came out? I did see that one commenter called Herman's Bachelormania her Roman Empire, the thing that she thinks about way too often.
Just some feedback from folks who were happy to see the update. And a few people who said that they had met the bachelors and the wives of the former bachelors over the years. And one person lamented that things were different back then, and that it was pretty unique for these stoic Minnesota farmers to share these intimate details of their lives at the time. Now with social media and reality TV, it's different. But she said, "We used to believe in boundaries."
That's so interesting. How do some of the other folks in Herman feel about it all decades later?
Yeah, I think people still ask the bachelors or the former bachelors and the residents about it. when they say where they're from, people will, be like, oh, were you part of that Bachelormania? And Gary said he thinks it was good for the town because, even though there wasn't a whole lot of economic growth, there was a lot of camaraderie and new people came to town for a bit. And of course, his children and grandchildren exist because of it.
Yeah, he has to be happy about it. But I could see it's an interesting chapter in Minnesota history and definitely in the town's history. So that's very cool.
Right. The thing that stood out to me is Gary saying someone from 2020, years later, asked him if he realized that they were sort of like the first reality show. Like it was broken into bits and pieces on different talk shows, but it all came before dating shows like The Bachelor and, Farmer Wants a Wife.
Super fascinating. That's a really good point. It gave the country a glimpse of how fun it is to follow along as people meet and either make it work or fail spectacularly.
Right. All in the public eye.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Jenny. That's it for today's show.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
You can read all of our Curious Minnesota stories online at startribune.com/curious. And thanks as always to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. If you have feedback for us or a question you want us to answer, you can send a note to curious@startribune.com.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.